Hello students, welcome again. Students, when we read the history of English literature and when we come across the period of Romantic revival, we get ourselves familiar with some major Romantic poets like S.T. Coleridge, William Wordsworth, Lord Byron, John Keats, P.B. Shelley, and so many others. These are the most important Romantic poets of the 19th century. In today's video lecture, we want to discuss William Wordsworth as a leading Romantic poet. We are going to discuss Wordsworth as the poet of nature. Now, let's begin. See, Wordsworth, who was born in 1770 and died in 1850, we can say that he was living in three different ages in the history of English literature. Number one, he was born in the period of Dr. Samuel Johnson in the age of transition. Number two, he wrote most of his poetry as a poet during the period of Romantic revival. And number three, towards the end of his life, he lived during the period of Victorian era. So he was the witness of these three different ages. Okay. Now, Wordsworth's contribution to English poetry is indeed commendable. Why? Because when he published lyrical ballads along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he became the founder leader of the new movement of English literature, which we know as the movement of Romanticism. Now, when we read Wordsworth's all poems, what we gather is that he was a great devotee, he was a great worshipper of nature, he loved rural life, he presented his love for the simplicity of life in most of his poems, right? His love for nature was very tender, and he believed that there is a spirit, there is some spiritual aspect which we as readers can find in nature. Or you can say that Wordsworth was in sharp contrast to Alexander Pope. Now, who was Alexander Pope? Alexander Pope was an important poet who lived in the beginning of 18th century. His poetry mostly expresses the town life, the artificial life of England in the beginning of the 18th century. But after 100 years, if you come to William Wordsworth, who lived in the beginning of the 19th century, there you find a contrast in his poems where we find that the poet Wordsworth is expressing his love for nature, his love for rural life. So Alexander Pope and William Wordsworth are two different poets who lived in two different ages, in whose poetry we find two different kinds of approach in literature, in poetry. Now, let me introduce you to the major poetical works of William Wordsworth. See, when Wordsworth was a university student, just like you students, when he was a young man studying in a university, he published several of his poems in popular magazines, and to name a few, you can say An Evening Walk, Descriptive Sketches. Okay, these two poems published in 1793, gave him a reputation as an important poet when still he was a university student. But Later on, when he adopted creative writing as his career as a poet, he published lyrical ballads 1798 with St. Coleridge. Now, this lyrical ballads consisted of 23 poems, out of which 19 poems were written by Wordsworth. And this lyrical ballads heralds a new era of Romanticism in English literature. Later on, he is also well known. Wordsworth is also known by his poems collected under one title, The Prelude. He started writing these poems published in The Prelude in 1799 and continued writing these poems till 1805. All these poems are mostly autobiographical by nature. And the last important contribution is the excursion. Okay, and this is written in 9 different books. In all these books, we find Wordsworth's poems on nature. Okay, so these are the 4 important major contributions. Number one, as the university students, he published these poems. Number two, in 1798, he published lyrical ballads. Number three, Prelude, which he wrote from 1799 to 1805. And number four, The Excursion, which was published in 1814. And these are, as you can see on the screen, these are some of the most memorable poems written by Wordsworth, which are included in the different anthologies of poems published by him. Okay, now when we read all these poems, hundreds of poems written by Wordsworth, we gather that his creed, his love for nature, has 3 different aspects. Number one, Wordsworth takes nature as a living personality. So when he talks about the rivers, when he talks about the flowers, the mountains, he is actually talking to the elements of nature. He believed that there is a living personality in all elements of nature. Number two, he believed that nature can console us in our bad times. Okay, nature can make us happy in our bad days. So this is the second thing. And the third thing is that he found some spiritual inspiration in all objects of nature, and Wordsworth thought that nature is a moral teacher of mankind. Nature is the nurse of mankind. Nature has the power to teach the greatest philosophies of life. So these 3 aspects which we come across in all his poems. And the next important thing that I want to tell you about William Wordsworth is that when we examine the whole career of Wordsworth as a poet, we can divide his career in 3 different stages. When he was young, when he was in his middle ages, and when he was an old man. So you can divide his career in 3 different stages. Number one, the first stage is the period of the blood. Here you can talk about his youthful days. Okay, Wordsworth spent his youthful days in the company of nature, in the company of natural surroundings. Okay, and here he was more attracted. He had developed a kind of physical attraction with nature during this first period. You can mark these lines: in youth from rock to rock I went. The poet talks about his youth and he says that I visited different rocks. I went from rock to rock, from hill to hill, in discontent. Discontent means in dissatisfaction, of pleasure high and turbulent, most pleased when most uneasy. In these lines, the poet wants to say that when I visited nature, when I visited the rocks, the hills, my dissatisfaction turned into satisfaction, my unhappiness turned into happiness. So simple love or attraction with nature is found in his youthful days. But second stage, when Wordsworth was in his middle ages, is found here. It is known as the period of senses. Here, slowly and gradually, you find a development of Wordsworth's attitude to nature. Now he listens to the sounds of nature. Now he listens to the voices of nature. Okay, and he finds an appetite, a kind of appetite or stronger attachment with nature during this second stage of his life. In Tinton Abbey is an important poem, very popular poem written by Wordsworth. There he mentions these things, as you can see on the screen, the tall rock, the mountain, the deep gloomy woods. He talks about the rock, the mountain, the gloomy, sad woods, their color and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling, and a love. So now, slowly and gradually, he comes closer to nature in his second stage. The third stage is known as the period of spirituality. Spirituality means he now starts finding the presence of God in all forms of nature. So when he looks at the clouds, when he looks at the stars, when he looks at the flowers, there he finds the presence of God. So he starts receiving some spiritual message, some moral message from all forms of nature during this third period of his life, and that is called the ultimate development in the life of William Wordsworth. Okay, now he starts in this period, he starts believing that there is a soul and a living personality in all the forms, in all the shapes of nature. Read these three lines: to every natural form, rock, fruit, or flower, even the loose stones that cover the highway, I gave a moral life, I saw them fill. He says that even a stone fills. Okay, a flower has the power of filling. Okay, so he takes the flower, the rock, the fruit as living things. Okay, and he receives some moral philosophies, moral lessons from these flowers and stones and fruits. Okay, so that is the ultimate development in his life. Another poem which is very popular written by Wordsworth is Immortality Ode. Here also he tells us that as a boy his love for nature was thoughtless in the first period. Okay, there was not much thought, there was attraction with nature, but later on, when he grows up, the objects of nature took a sober coloring from his eyes and gave rise to profound thoughts. Profound thought means deep thoughts. Later on, he finds some deeper meanings in all elements of nature. Okay, so remember these three stages. Okay, the first stage, that is the stage of the blood. Second stage, say stage of the senses, and third stage is the stage of spirituality. Now, different historians have also considered Wordsworth as a didactic poet. Didactic poet means a poet who teaches some moral lessons to the mankind, to the readers. And Wordsworth himself believed, he said that every great poet is a teacher. I wish either to be considered as a teacher or as nothing. So Wordsworth himself had this strong feeling, he had this strong belief. He believed that every poet must be a good teacher first and poet later. And that is the reason why, Wordsworth tries to teach something always in all his nature poems. Okay, he was not the poet like those other poets whose main object in writing poetry was simply to please or delight the readers. Okay, he had a philosophical mind, and just like a philosopher, he believed that it is my responsibility to teach the mankind. Even when he wrote a letter to Lady Beaumont, okay, he said that the purpose of writing poetry is what? Why do I write poetry? He wrote this thing to Lady Beaumont, and he said that I am writing poetry to console the afflicted, to add sunshine to daylight by making the happy happier, to teach the young and the gracious of every age. Okay, there are little bit there are some spelling mistakes here, typing errors. Okay, so please forgive me for that, but let me explain this quote to you. He says that it is my responsibility as a poet to add sunshine in the life of the people. It is my responsibility to make the happy person a happier man. And it is my responsibility as a poet to teach the young generation. So that is the reason why we consider Wordsworth as a didactic poet. Okay, another important aspect that we find in his poetry is that he considered nature as a great teacher. Okay, Wordsworth teaches us that we must adore, we must respect and worship nature. It is his great message that nature can be the teacher of humanity and nature can make us happy. Okay, he believed that we can learn so many things from nature, more of moral and evil and good from nature. Okay, if you mark these lines, one impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. Sages means the saints. Even the saints cannot teach you more than what nature does. Okay, so in his eyes, in Wordsworth's eyes, nature is a teacher. So that is what he has presented in most of his poems. Another important element about his poetry is mysticism. Mysticism means too much of spiritualism. Okay, Wordsworth's mysticism is something new during the 19th century. Why? Because we know that all through the 18th century we do not find any spiritual aspects. Most of the neoclassical literature is what? It is expressing the artificial life of the urban people or city people. But with Wordsworth, you find for the first time during the 19th century, you find this divine spirit or spiritualism in all the smaller elements of nature. Even when he talks about the flower, he talks about the birds, he talks about insects or stones, there also he finds the presence of God. You mark these three lines. He writes that I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sunshine sublime. So he has that sublime experiences when he is in the company of nature. So here we come to the end, and let me conclude by saying that Wordsworth's attitude to nature is very much different from all other poets of nature. Okay, like Byron also wrote some poetry on nature. Shelley and Keats also write some poems on nature. But Wordsworth was a philosopher, was a spiritualist poet when he presents nature in his poem. Why? Because he is rightly believed that he is rightly believed to be the priest of nature who worshipped nature in all its aspects, in all its different forms, and he finds the presence of God in the stones, in flowers, in clouds, and all other objects of nature. So here we come to the end of this discussion. If you have any doubts or questions, do write to me in the comment section of this channel, and please, if you really liked this video, do share this video among all your friends and classmates. Thank you for watching. Thank you.